Sophie Williams had been running on fumes all day. Imagine a night filled with relentless shifts. Cleaning up after demanding guests in a bustling hotel where every corner and corridor echoed with the weight of responsibility. Her back ached as if it carried the burdens of every guest's complaint, and her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, barely stayed open. This night was no different, yet it felt exceptionally cruel. At last, she reached the final room on her list, the illustrious penthouse suite. As she stepped through the heavy, polished door, the contrast struck her immediately. The suite was the epitome of opulence, a world away from the mundanity of her daily routine. The floors were laid in gleaming marble, so reflective they turned every flicker of light into dancing shadows. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like clusters of frozen stars, casting a soft, mesmerizing glow. And the bed. Oh, the bed. It was enormous, so vast that Sophie couldn't help but wonder if it could swallow up her modest apartment whole. She paused for a moment, a tired smile flickering on her lips as she muttered under her breath, "Rich people." It was a small, resigned comment on the absurdity of the luxury that surrounded her. Yet, even with her weariness, there was an underlying spark of curiosity, an instinct that something extraordinary might be waiting in these hallowed halls. With a resigned sigh, Sophie picked up her trusty mop and set about her task. The room was immaculate, almost too perfect for someone who had seen the relentless grind of housekeeping. Dust was practically a foreign concept here. Every surface shone, every detail meticulously arranged. She moved methodically, her motions slow and deliberate, her mind already racing ahead to the promise of sleep when this long shift would finally be over. Then came the bathroom, a cavernous space that exuded luxury from every gleaming tile and polished fixture. As Sophie pushed open the frosted glass door, her senses were hit by the cool, clinical smell of expensive toiletries mixed with a hint of fresh linen. She stepped inside, prepared to scrub and polish every surface, when something unexpected caught her eye. In the center of the lavish bathroom, dominating the space like an uninvited guest, was a massive bathtub. But it wasn't the bathtub itself that made her freeze. It was what lay within it. There, sprawled out in a manner that defied all expectation, was a man. Not just any man. He was lying there, completely still, as if he had been lulled into a deep slumber by the calm of the surroundings. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to slow. Sophie's mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible. Had someone broken in? Was this man a drunken guest who had lost his way? Or, in the darkest of possibilities, was he already dead? Her thoughts tumbled chaotically, each scenario more shocking than the last. The shock sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. Her hand, still gripping the mop, trembled slightly as she took a hesitant step forward. Every inch that she moved felt like an eternity, a delicate progression into the unknown. The silence in the room was thick, punctuated only by the rapid pounding of her heart, echoing in her ears like a relentless drum. Then, as if the moment itself couldn't stretch any longer, the man in the bathtub shifted. A subtle movement at first, a twitch of a hand, a slight flutter of an eyelid. Then, in a flash, his eyes flew open. They snapped into focus, wide and piercing, meeting Sophie's startled gaze. In that frozen moment, every detail seemed to come alive. The shock on Sophie's face, the slight disarray in the man's dark hair, the unexpected intrusion of reality into her weary night. All melded together into a scene so surreal, it was as if the world had tilted on its axis. Here, in the midst of pristine luxury, lay the beginning of a mystery that would upend everything Sophie thought she knew about her own life. And so, With her heart pounding like never before, Sophie stood at the threshold of an unforeseen adventure, a moment of discovery that promised to change everything in ways she could hardly imagine. "What the hell?" The deep, commanding voice exploded through the marble bathroom, its sharp tone ricocheting off the pristine walls like a gunshot in the night. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, filled with raw confusion and fury. The once quiet luxury of the penthouse was suddenly drowned in the sound of his outburst, sending a chill down Sophie's spine. Sophie let out a scream, a startled, high-pitched sound of pure panic. It escaped her lips before she could control it, her breath catching in her throat. Her body tensed, her fingers involuntarily tightening around the mop handle before it slipped from her grasp. The wooden stick hit the marble floor with a loud, clattering noise, bouncing once before smacking against the base of the gleaming sink. The dirty water sloshed from the mop head, forming a small, murky puddle on the otherwise spotless floor. Her heart pounded violently against her ribcage, so hard she swore she could hear it. The sudden adrenaline rush sent every nerve in her body into overdrive, her senses hyper-focused on the man in the bathtub. He jerked upright, his movement so sudden that for a moment she thought he might lunge at her. His dark hair was a wild, tousled mess, sticking up at odd angles from what must have been an extremely deep sleep. The slight creases on his cheekbone suggested he had been in that position for quite some time. His shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing the hint of a toned, well-defined torso. His arms, now propped on the sides of the tub, were tense, as if his body had gone from total relaxation to high alert in an instant. His eyes, a piercing, ice-cold shade of gray, locked onto her with such intensity that Sophie felt as though she had been physically pinned in place. There was no softness in them, no lingering remnants of sleep. It was as if, the moment he had woken up, he had assessed the situation and was already in control. Sophie took a step back, her entire body trembling. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she tried to process what was happening. She had just found a man, not just any man, asleep in a bathtub inside the penthouse suite. And that was when realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't some random guest who had wandered in by mistake. This wasn't an intoxicated businessman who had passed out after a long night of drinking. This was Lucas Blackwell. The Lucas Blackwell. Sophie's stomach dropped. The name itself was enough to send shockwaves through anyone's system. Lucas Blackwell, billionaire mogul, owner of this very hotel chain, and one of the most powerful men in the industry. His face was plastered across the covers of business magazines, the subject of every article that dissected his empire, his decisions, his latest billion-dollar acquisitions. He was elusive, untouchable, a living legend in the corporate world. And yet here he was, disheveled, shirt slightly open, a hint of annoyance pulling at his sharp features, sitting in a damn bathtub. Sophie's pulse roared in her ears, a dizzying blend of fear and disbelief rushing through her. What the hell was he doing here? Why was he sleeping in a bathtub? And more importantly, what was going to happen to her now that she had seen him like this? The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a collapsing building. The intensity in his gaze never wavered, his chiseled jaw clenching slightly as he took in her presence. She could practically hear the calculation behind those sharp gray eyes, assessing, processing, deciding. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She was standing in front of a man who could fire her, ruin her, make her disappear from this hotel and this job in the blink of an eye. And she had just caught him napping in a bathtub. This was bad. Very, very bad. The weight of silence hung thick between them, stretching for an unbearable second before Lucas exhaled sharply. His hand came up to his forehead, fingers pressing against his temple as if physically trying to push away the situation he had woken up to. The tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw flexed ever so slightly, it all hinted at the irritation simmering beneath his controlled exterior. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble when he finally spoke. "You—" He paused, shaking his head slightly, as if still trying to make sense of what was happening. "Why are you here?" Sophie, who had been gripping the edge of her uniform so tightly that her knuckles turned white, forced herself to breathe. The air felt too thick, the room too small, despite its extravagant size. She was still trying to process the fact that she had not only found Lucas Blackwell, asleep in a bathtub, but that he was now looking at her as if she were the intruder. And maybe in a way she was. Still, she found her voice, though it wavered slightly. I work here?" Lucas's storm-gray eyes flickered, sharp and unreadable as they scanned her face. His presence was overwhelming, an aura of control and quiet power radiating from him, even in his disheveled state. His expression remained impassive, but the slight narrowing of his gaze made something in Sophie's stomach tighten. "No one is allowed in my suite." The words weren't just spoken. They were delivered with the kind of finality that only someone accustomed to absolute control could muster. Sophie blinked. Seriously? She had spent the last 12 hours scrubbing floors, changing sheets, and dodging unreasonable guest complaints. And this was the thanks she got? She hadn't even wanted to be in his ridiculously large, needlessly extravagant bathroom. She had a job to do. And frankly, if he didn't want housekeeping coming in, maybe he should have locked the damn door. Frustration bubbled up before she could filter her response. "Well, someone should have told that to the guy who scheduled housekeeping," she shot back, crossing her arms before she could stop herself. The second the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Had she seriously just sassed Lucas Blackwell? Her heart slammed against her ribs. She was about to be fired. Hell, maybe even blacklisted from every hotel under his name. But instead of the cold, cutting response she expected, something unexpected happened. For the briefest moment, so fleeting she almost thought she imagined it, Lucas's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. There was a flicker of amusement in his sharp gaze, as though she had caught him off guard. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened. It was like watching a switch flip. The casual, half-awake man she had startled just moments ago was gone, replaced by Lucas Blackwell, the businessman. The air around him shifted, thickening with authority, the kind that could command boardrooms, negotiate billion-dollar deals, and make entire industries tremble with a single decision. Sophie swallowed hard. Then, in one fluid motion, Lucas rose to his full height. And dear God, he was tall. The moment he stood, everything changed. He was no longer a groggy man waking up from an impromptu nap. He was now towering over her, all crisp angles and refined strength, a presence so commanding that Sophie had to fight the instinct to take a step back. His voice was steady, low and smooth as silk when he spoke. "All right," he said, his tone eerily calm. "You saw nothing. You say nothing." Sophie's breath hitched. Wait, what? She blinked, trying to process what he had just said. "Excuse me?" Lucas's expression remained unreadable as he tucked his hands into his pockets. A calculated movement, one that exuded ease, yet carried an unmistakable edge. "I'll pay you," he continued, voice still composed, as if he were discussing nothing more than a business transaction. "Double your salary. You forget this ever happened." Sophie stared at him. Double her salary? Just to pretend she never found a billionaire passed out in a bathtub? She should say yes. She should take the money, thank him, and go back to pretending like she wasn't moments away from a panic attack. But something inside her bristled. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working double shifts. Maybe it was the indignation of being dismissed like some disposable inconvenience. Or maybe it was the fact that Lucas Blackwell, a man who clearly got whatever he wanted with a simple command, thought that she was just another problem he could make disappear. So instead of nodding, instead of backing down, she crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" The words were out before she could think better of them. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Lucas's brows lifted slightly, as though genuinely intrigued by her defiance. And then, something unexpected happened. The corner of his lips tugged upward ever so slightly, not in amusement, in challenge. His gray eyes gleamed with something dangerous, something that made Sophie's skin prickle. "Then," he murmured, voice dropping lower, smoother, infinitely more dangerous, "I might have to make things interesting." Sophie's breath caught. The way he said it, the way he was watching her now, made it sound less like a threat and more like a promise. A promise of what? She wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. She was playing with fire. She tried to chew, but the sheer assault of overpowering, clashing ingredients made it nearly impossible. Without thinking, she blurted out, "This is awful." The words echoed through the kitchen like a slap. Every chef in the room stiffened. Marco's jaw tightened. Someone dropped a spoon. Sophie froze. Shit. She hadn't meant to say that out loud. Lucas, however, didn't react the way she expected. Instead of getting angry, his eyebrow lifted slightly. "Go on." Sophie hesitated, but something in his tone, calm, measured, like he was testing her, made her swallow her nerves and push forward. "The seasoning is all wrong," she pointed at the dish. "The sauce is too thick. It's drowning the other flavors." She took another bite, forcing herself to focus. "And did they use powdered cheese?" She blinked, looking up at Marco in horror. "In a 5-star hotel?" Marco's face turned red. A tense silence settled over the kitchen, the air so thick it was practically suffocating. And then, Lucas did something no one expected. He laughed, a short, quiet chuckle, barely audible, but definitely there. Sophie's stomach flipped. What was so funny? Lucas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze sharp and filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Impressive," he said smoothly. "I've been trying to figure out why our food is subpar for months. You picked it up in one bite." Sophie blinked. "Wait. What? He was serious?" She looked around the kitchen, searching for some kind of hidden camera, because this had to be a joke. Marco, still visibly fuming, opened his mouth to protest, but Lucas lifted a hand, silencing him without a word. "You have a rare talent," Lucas continued, setting his cup down. "I want you to help fix it." Sophie's mouth fell open. Was this some kind of power move? Was he trying to humiliate her in front of his staff? She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I clean rooms, Blackwell, not critique gourmet meals." Lucas didn't blink, didn't waver. Instead, he smirked. A slow, knowing, infuriatingly confident smirk. "Well," he said casually, "now you do both." Sophie's heart skipped. What? The hell had she just gotten herself into? The next morning, Sophie forced herself back into her usual routine, determined to put last night's bizarre encounter behind her. Lucas Blackwell and his weird habit of sleeping in bathtubs? Didn't happen. Lucas Blackwell offering her money to keep quiet? She was wiping that from her memory, too. Lucas Blackwell looking at her like she was some sort of puzzle he wanted to solve? That was the hardest part to forget. She moved through the hallways of the hotel with practiced efficiency, pushing her cleaning cart as she ticked off each room on her list. Fresh linens, fluffed pillows, floors wiped to a shine. She was used to blending into the background, existing in the spaces guests passed through without a second thought, and she liked it that way. But apparently, Lucas Blackwell had other plans. Just as she was finishing up in one of the executive suites, she heard her name being called. Williams. She turned, startled, to find Marco, the head chef, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, a man known for his impossible standards and zero patience for mistakes. Sophie wiped her hands on her uniform and frowned. Something wrong? Marco didn't bother with pleasantries. Blackwell wants you in the kitchen. Sophie blinked. What? She glanced at the bed she had just made, then back at the chef. Why? Marco let out a short, humorless chuckle. You think I ask questions when the CEO gives orders? Fair point. Still, as she followed him through the hotel, her stomach twisted with unease. She had zero business being in the kitchen. The only thing she knew about the hotel's restaurant was that the food was expensive, and she never had enough in her paycheck to eat there. So why on earth was Lucas dragging her into whatever this was? A minute later, she found out. The confrontation. Lucas was already waiting when she stepped into the kitchen. He looked completely at ease, seated at the chef's table with a steaming cup of espresso in one hand, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms. He barely acknowledged her entrance, his focus instead on the plate of food in front of him. Taste it. Sophie's brow furrowed. Excuse me? Lucas finally glanced up, his gray eyes cool and expectant. You heard me. Her stomach clenched. What was his deal? She hesitated, looking between him and Marco, who stood silently beside the cooking staff. The tension in the kitchen was thick, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Sophie was not a chef. She was barely even a good cook. The last thing she needed was to embarrass herself in front of the most powerful man in the building. Still, she wasn't sure what would happen if she refused. With a sigh, she picked up a fork, speared a bite of the food, and took a cautious taste. The moment the flavors hit her tongue, her entire face twisted. Oh God. It was bad. Really bad. Sophie was convinced yesterday had been the peak of insanity. Getting dragged into the kitchen? Being forced to taste an overpriced disaster of a dish? Lucas Blackwell, billionaire, CEO, and probably slightly unhinged, looking at her like she had just cracked some unsolvable mystery? Yeah, that had to be the craziest thing that would happen to her. Until he invited her to Paris. Sophie froze mid-step, gripping the handle of her cleaning cart like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. I'm sorry. What? Lucas stood in front of her, as effortlessly composed as ever, his hands tucked into his pockets. The man never looked out of place. Whether in a penthouse suite or a Michelin star kitchen, he owned every room he stepped into. And right now, he was waiting for her answer. Paris, he repeated smoothly, for a food event. I want you to come with me. Sophie blinked, then blinked again. Then, because her brain refused to process that sentence properly, she let out a disbelieving laugh. You want me to go to Paris? Lucas nodded, unfazed. Yes. She let out a short breath. Let me get this straight. She lifted a hand, counting off on her fingers. You want me, a maid, to fly to another country, to attend a fancy event, with you, a billionaire? Correct. Are you insane? Lucas tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching like he was enjoying this. Probably. Sophie stared at him. She waited for the punchline, for him to smirk and say he was joking. He didn't. His expression remained calm, certain, and just amused enough to make her stomach twist. He was serious. Dead serious. And that scared her more than anything. The weight of the moment. Sophie swallowed, her mind spinning. Her entire life, people had overlooked her. She had been the girl who worked quietly in the background, invisible to the world. The one who cleaned up after the people who actually mattered. She was used to being dismissed, to being told that she was meant for one thing and one thing only. Hard work. No one had ever looked at her like she was worth something more. No one had ever offered her a way out of the cycle she thought she was stuck in. But now, Lucas Blackwell was standing in front of her, holding open a door she never even knew existed. And she had no idea what scared her more, the possibility that this was all some elaborate joke, or the possibility that he actually meant it. Her heart pounded. Sophie looked at him. Really looked at him. Lucas Blackwell, billionaire, hotel magnate, and for some insane, unfathomable reason, he saw something in her. Her fingers tightened around the cleaning cart. This was crazy. This was completely insane. But for the first time in forever, Sophie wanted to believe she was more than just what people told her she was. She took a slow breath and made a choice. Fine. Lucas's smirk deepened. Good choice. The moment Sophie stepped off the plane, she knew she was in way over her head. Paris was a dream and a nightmare. The city was breathtaking. Cobblestone streets lined with historic buildings, golden streetlights casting a warm glow over the romantic skyline, the distant hum of conversation from chic cafes, and the unmistakable aroma of fresh bread and espresso floating in the crisp evening air. For someone who had spent most of her life scrubbing floors and changing linens, walking through Paris alongside Lucas, Blackwell felt like she had stepped into a movie. But reality? Reality was far less charming. Because wherever Lucas went, eyes followed. Wherever she went, whispers trailed behind. And it wasn't long before Sophie realized she was walking into a battlefield. Thrown into the lion's den. The first event of the weekend was an exclusive private dinner, one of those gatherings where millionaires and celebrities sipped overpriced wine and talked about things Sophie couldn't even begin to relate to. Lucas, of course, belonged effortlessly. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he moved through the crowd like he owned the world. And in a way, he did. Sophie, on the other hand? She felt like a fraud. She tried to ignore the curious glances, the way people whispered behind crystal champagne flutes. But it was impossible to miss the looks. She was out of place. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. But no one made that clearer than Victoria Monroe, Lucas's ex. Tall, flawless, dressed in a sleek black gown that probably cost more than Sophie's entire life savings. She was the type of woman who belonged in this world. Sophie didn't even have to be introduced to her to know who she was. Because the moment Victoria's icy blue eyes landed on her, Sophie felt the temperature in the room drop. Victoria smirked, taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. "Lucas," she purred, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "It's been too long." Lucas didn't flinch, didn't even react. He simply gave her a cool, unreadable look. "Victoria." And then, as if Sophie wasn't standing right there, Victoria let her gaze slide toward her, assessing, calculating, judging. And just like that, Sophie knew what this was. A test. Victoria tilted her head, her expression one of faux curiosity. "And you are?" Sophie opened her mouth, but before she could even speak, Victoria turned back to Lucas with a condescending smile. "Surely she's not who you brought with you." The words were daggers wrapped in silk. A few guests stifled amused chuckles. Sophie felt her stomach twist. But before she could react, Before she could figure out a way to disappear into the floorboards, Lucas moved. He stepped closer to her, and without a flicker of hesitation, he said, "Actually, she's better at this than all of you." The room goes still. The air in the lavish dining hall shifted. Silence. Complete, deafening silence. The quiet was louder than any insult. Sophie felt her pulse skyrocket. Her ears rang. Did he just... Victoria's expression faltered. For the first time, the perfectly composed, untouchable socialite looked rattled. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "Excuse me?" Lucas turned to her, his gaze sharp, piercing, a challenge. "You heard me." A few guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether to be entertained or horrified. Sophie? She felt like the entire world had just shifted beneath her feet. Because this wasn't just a statement. Lucas Blackwell had just declared war. And Sophie was right in the middle of it. Sophie woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Half asleep, she reached for it, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. The moment she saw the screen, however, she froze. 27 missed calls. 42 unread messages. Her heart dropped. What the... Before she could process it, a sharp knock sounded at her hotel room door. Sophie. Lucas. His voice was calm. Too calm. Something was very, very wrong. Still in her oversized hotel robe, Sophie rushed to the door and yanked it open. Lucas stood there, phone in hand, dressed in his usual effortless, crisp suit. His expression was unreadable, but she knew that look. Something had happened. Before she could ask, he turned his phone toward her. Her stomach plummeted. The headlines that changed everything Billionaire CEOs: Mystery Woman, Maid or Mistress, Lucas Blackwell's secret affair exposed, Scandal in Paris, who is the woman in Lucas Blackwell's life? Her hands shook. It was everywhere. Photos of her and Lucas together at the dinner. A zoomed-in shot of the moment he had stepped closer to her at the event. A damning headline questioning how a maid ended up at a billionaire's side. Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Oh my God. Lucas, in contrast, looked completely unbothered. Crisis? What crisis? He walked past her into the suite, calmly pouring himself a glass of water from the minibar. "We'll handle it," he said smoothly, as if this wasn't a complete catastrophe. Sophie whirled around. "We?" she repeated, her voice rising. "No, no, no, this is your mess, Blackwell." She held up her phone. "People think I'm sleeping with you." Lucas took a casual sip of water, unfazed. "I noticed." "Noticed?" she nearly shrieked. "This is a PR nightmare. I'm not some rich socialite who can just brush off a scandal. I'm a hotel maid, Lucas. This could ruin my life." His gaze hardened. Slowly, he set the glass down and took one deliberate step closer. "It's not just my mess," he said evenly. "It's our mess." Sophie's breath caught. Something about the way he said it, firm, unshakable, sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she wasn't part of his world, that this wasn't something she signed up for, wanted to tell him to fix it. But instead, she just stood there, staring at him, completely torn. Because the truth was, she didn't know whether she wanted to strangle him or kiss him. And that was the real problem. The tension had been building all day. Sophie could feel it in every glance Lucas gave her, in every unreadable expression, in every moment of silence that stretched too long. The scandal was everywhere. The whispers, the reporters camping outside the hotel, the way everyone looked at her differently now, like she was something she wasn't, like she was just a maid who got lucky. But that wasn't what really kept her up that night. It was him. Lucas Blackwell. The man who had dragged her into this chaos. The man who defended her in front of everyone. The man who made her feel like she was more than she ever thought she could be. And she needed to know. Needed to understand what this was. So she went to his suite, a confrontation in the dark. Sophie knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. Frustrated, she grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, only the golden glow from the Paris skyline spilling through the glass windows. Lucas stood by the window, back to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't turn when she stepped inside. Didn't say a word. And Sophie had had enough. She crossed the room, stopping just a few feet behind him. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "What am I to you?" Lucas went completely still. The air in the room shifted. She waited. Waited for him to give her one of his smooth, practiced responses. For him to throw out a joke, to deflect. But he didn't. Instead, he set his glass down on the windowsill, exhaling sharply. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Raw, honest, unfiltered. A confession he never expected to make. "You're the only person who doesn't treat me like a god." Sophie's breath caught. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't that. Lucas turned then, finally looking at her. His eyes were dark, intense, guarded. "You don't see my money. You don't see my power. You see me." He let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "And I think—" He hesitated, his voice quieter now. "I think that terrifies me." Sophie's heart raced. She had never seen him like this. Vulnerable, uncertain. For the first time, he wasn't Lucas Blackwell, billionaire CEO. He was just Lucas, a man who wasn't used to being seen for who he really was. And without thinking, without hesitating, she stepped forward. Close enough to feel his warmth. Close enough to hear the sharp exhale he let out at her nearness. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then stop being scared." Lucas stared at her. A muscle in his jaw tensed. His hands twitched at his sides, like he was fighting something, fighting this, and then he gave in. In one swift motion, he closed the distance between them. His hands cupped her face. And then he kissed her. A kiss that changed everything. The moment their lips met, everything else disappeared. The scandal, the whispers, the world outside that hotel room. Lucas kissed her like a man who had been holding himself back for too long. Like a man who had just lost a battle he never wanted to win. And Sophie? She kissed him back just as desperately, because she knew, whatever this was, whatever they had just started, it was dangerous. But she also knew it was already too late to stop. The world was watching. The tabloids were hungry for more. Sophie saw the headlines every morning, her name tangled with Lucas's in bold, dramatic letters. From maid to mistress, the woman who stole Lucas Blackwell's heart. Scandal in Paris. Who is Sophie Williams? The billionaire and the housekeeper, a modern Cinderella story. She should have been furious, should have been afraid. But standing beside Lucas, feeling the warmth of his hand wrapped around hers, she realized something. She didn't care. Because for the first time in her life, she was choosing herself. The city of second chances. Paris had always been a dream, but now? Now it was something more. It was the place where she stopped being invisible, where she stopped playing small, where she looked a billionaire in the eye and refused to back down. She had spent years believing she was just a maid, just another girl trying to survive. But Lucas Blackwell had forced her to see herself differently, had forced her to see what she was capable of. And now, Now she was done waiting for life to happen to her. Now she was ready to rewrite her story. Lucas Blackwell had finally met his match. He stood beside her on the hotel's penthouse balcony, the Paris skyline stretching endlessly before them. A week ago, Lucas Blackwell had been untouchable, a man who let no one get close, who never let anyone see the cracks beneath the surface. But now he was staring at Sophie like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. He had built an empire, had everything money could buy. And yet, with one unexpected woman, everything had changed. She challenged him. She terrified him. And worst of all, she made him want more. He tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her closer. His voice was quiet, but firm. "Are you ready?" Sophie tilted her head, smirking. "For what?" Lucas brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering. "For whatever comes next." Sophie's heart raced. Because this wasn't just a scandal anymore. This was a new beginning. And she was all in.